Good evening, night owls. Tonight we're climbing onto the most blinding, most photographed, and most quietly broke runway that history has ever produced, the world of the 1990s supermodel. Not the version you've seen in glossy retrospectives, all cheekbones and flashbulbs and wind machines blowing hair that never seems to tangle. I mean the actual version, where a 19-year-old could earn more money in a single afternoon than her father earned in a year, and still end that same month somehow owing her own agency for a hotel room, a tube of concealer, and a mattress she shared with 5 other frightened girls. Thank you, as always, to the person who suggested tonight's subject in the comments. This channel only grows because of requests like yours, so if late-night history walks are your thing, tap subscribe, but only if you actually mean it. Tell me down below where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now, because it's always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere on this planet. And if your eyes are closed and you're just listening, we're on Spotify now too, link tucked quietly in the description. Dim the lights, let the fan hum in the background. Get comfortable because tonight we're asking some strange questions. How does a human being earn $10,000 in a single working day and still not be able to casually afford dinner? Did supermodels eat, or did they simply absorb nutrients from the studio lighting? Could you walk a runway in heels engineered by someone who clearly hated feet? Could you stand still while strangers wrapped a tape measure around your hips and sighed audibly? And could you keep smiling the entire time somebody was quietly handing you an invoice for the privilege of being there? Tonight you get to find out. Congratulations, you've just opened your eyes in the year 1990. You have cheekbones a sculptor would weep over, a suitcase full of clothes that technically belong to someone else, and an agency that has already somehow decided you owe them money. Good luck out there. Let's begin at the birth of every supermodel legend, the discovery. In the fairy tale, a scout with an eagle eye spots you across a crowded room, gasps audibly, and sweeps you toward a life of private jets and perfume campaigns. In the real version, you were 17 years old, standing in line at a shopping mall food court with a milkshake in one hand, when a stranger pressed a business card into your palm and told you that you could be somebody. It felt like being struck by lightning in the best possible way. Nobody mentioned that lightning, in this case, came itemized. These discovery stories were the industry's favorite piece of marketing, and they were polished until they practically glowed. The girl found at an airport gate, the one plucked from behind a diner counter, the one whose photograph her own mother mailed in on a whim to a magazine contest, never expecting a reply. These tailies existed for a reason. They made the entire business feel like destiny reaching down and tapping a shoulder, rather than what it actually was, which was a company quietly combing small towns and shopping malls for a very specific bone structure it could rent out later. And you believed every word because who wouldn't? You were young enough to mistake luck for a personality trait. The scout mentioned Paris the way most people mention the next town over, and Tokyo like it was a bus stop 2 streets away, and suddenly, your entire ordinary life started to feel like a rough draft that was finally being corrected. Here is what the fairy tale conveniently skips. Being discovered did not mean being chosen. It meant being added to a very long waiting list of hopefuls, every single one of whom had also been discovered, also called special, also promised the same glittering future. The scout, more often than not, collected a small finder's fee for bringing you in, which meant their excitement about your face was less a compliment and more a commission check waiting to clear. You weren't a rare bird they'd spotted in the wild. You were freshly sourced inventory. Then came the test shots, because before anyone spent real money building you into a name, they needed to know whether the magic you had in person survived the flatness of a camera lens. Plenty of discovered girls were quietly filtered out at exactly this stage, thanked politely, and sent home with nothing but a story for future dinner parties. The discovery itself had cost the agency almost nothing. The heartbreak, on the other hand, was entirely yours to keep. And if you did survive the culling, The celebration lasted about as long as it takes to sign a Polaroid release form, because the meter had already started running. Every test photo, every reprint, every phone call placed on your behalf, all of it was quietly entered into a ledger somewhere, a ledger that would eventually reintroduce itself to you as a bill. It's a little like being handed an adorable puppy, only to discover later that you'd also silently signed up for a lifetime of vet visits, grooming appointments, and a mysterious recurring charge labeled simply miscellaneous. So yes, you were discovered, in the most literal sense of the word. Somebody spotted something valuable in you and moved fast to lock it down before a rival agency could get there first. What nobody said out loud was that being valuable and being paid are two entirely separate arrangements, and the space between them was about to define the next several years of your life. The lottery ticket was real. You simply never got a chance to read the odds printed on the back of it. Now it's time to sign. An agent slides a stack of paper across the desk thicker than your high school yearbook, written in something that resembles English but functions more like a legal minefield. Everyone in the room is smiling. Everyone keeps using the word family. You're told this is completely standard, that every single girl signs exactly this, that you should feel lucky to even be sitting in this chair. So you sign because you're 17 and dazzled, and nobody ever taught a teenager how to negotiate a commission percentage. Picture the actual scene. You're barely old enough to have a driver's license. Your mother is beside you, clutching her purse a little too tightly, both of you nodding along to sentences neither of you fully understands. Across the desk sits somebody warm, confident, and extremely well rehearsed in this exact conversation, because they have had this exact conversation hundreds of times before with hundreds of other 17-year-olds. They are not technically lying to you. They are simply not slowing down long enough for you to catch what you're agreeing to. The contract locks you to the agency, often exclusively, for years, meaning you can't quietly shop yourself around for a better deal elsewhere. It grants them commission on everything you earn, which sounds perfectly fair on its face. Then, buried a little further down, it grants them the right to charge you for a dazzling menu of expenses. It authorizes advances, those friendly little loans, and quietly stipulates in smaller print that every cent will be repaid. Try for a moment to imagine arguing with any of it. You can't really. You have no lawyer, no leverage, no experience, and a very real fear that asking too many questions will get you labeled difficult, at which point they simply move on to the next hopeful sitting in the waiting room. So you smile. You sign. It's a bit like agreeing to a cell phone contract you never actually read, except this time, the phone is your entire future. The genius of the arrangement was in how ordinary it felt. Every single girl signed some version of the same deal, so it stopped looking like a bargain and started looking like weather, something you simply accepted rather than questioned. Nobody argues with rain. And the word family did an enormous amount of heavy lifting here, because families, presumably, don't send itemized invoices. Except this family did, religiously, every single month, and the warmth in the room did absolutely nothing to soften the arithmetic waiting quietly down the road. Consider what you actually handed over with your signature: a slice of every dollar you would ever earn, a promise to repay money you hadn't yet borrowed, an agreement to pay for services you hadn't yet received, all of it before you'd booked a single paying job. You had, in effect, signed a promise to be profitable for other people, with your own profit listed somewhere near the bottom as an optional extra. The cruelest detail of all is that reading the contract more carefully wouldn't have saved you anyway. Even understanding every clause perfectly wouldn't have given you the power to change a single one, and there was nowhere better to go instead. This wasn't really an agreement between equals. It was a beautifully worded description of the terms under which you'd be permitted to chase your own dream. So you signed, full of hope, with absolutely no idea that the single most important negotiation of your entire career had already ended before you realized it had started. Time to pack a suitcase because you're leaving the country. Maybe it's New York. Maybe it's Milan. Maybe it's a city in France you couldn't have located on a map last month. You are barely old enough to drive a car, and you're about to cross an ocean by yourself to chase a career that, technically, did not exist for you a week ago. Your mother cries at the departure gate. The agency calls it an investment in your future. You privately call it terrifying. And the very flight carrying you there, the one that feels so impossibly glamorous right now, has already, quietly, been logged onto a bill you haven't seen and can't yet imagine. The logic was blunt and unsentimental. The paying work existed in a handful of cities scattered across the globe, and if you wanted to actually work, you went to where the clients were. That meant leaving home, leaving school, leaving every adult who might have looked out for you, and landing somewhere enormous and indifferent with a phrase book and a prayer. Picture the arrival itself. You step off a long-haul flight, hollow and jet-lagged, into a terminal where the signage is in a language you don't read, and the announcements sound like elegant static. Someone may be there to collect you, or they may not, depending entirely on how organized the local office happens to feel that particular week. You are 17, alone, and thousands of miles from anyone who knows your middle name. A sentence that should alarm any sensible adult, and somehow alarmed almost none of the adults actually involved. The isolation back then was total in a way that's difficult to picture now, in an age when everyone's pocket contains a phone. Calling home meant an expensive, carefully rationed long-distance call, the line crackling, the seconds ticking away like a taxi meter. There was no quick text to your mother at midnight, no video call to steady your nerves before a big casting. You were genuinely, physically far away, and that distance was doing quiet, deliberate work. It's remarkably easy to keep somebody dependent on you when they have no one else nearby to ask for a second opinion. And naturally, the flight itself was never free. That ticket, booked so efficiently on your behalf, was money spent. And money spent on you was money you now owed. So before you'd even unpacked a single bag, before you'd worked out which direction the city center actually was, you were already further in debt, for the sheer privilege of being delivered to the place where you might, eventually, someday, get to earn something. The word investment did an enormous amount of quiet lifting in these conversations. It made the whole arrangement sound noble, forward-thinking, almost wise. You weren't being charged for an airplane seat. You were investing in yourself, a lovely phrase that means exactly the same thing while wearing a much nicer coat. It's the difference between spending money and losing money, dressed up for a formal dinner. Notice how strange this arrangement actually was when you step back from it. In almost any other profession on earth, an employer who needs you somewhere pays to get you there. In this world, the arrangement flipped entirely on its head. You paid, through mounting debt, to be relocated to the very job that might someday pay you. The opportunity to work was structured like a luxury item you were purchasing on credit. There was real excitement mixed in, too, of course. A teenager alone in Milan or New York for the first time, wide-eyed at the sheer size and speed of everything, thrilled that her ordinary life had suddenly cracked open into something enormous. That thrill was genuine, and it made the underlying fear far easier to swallow. It's remarkably easy to ignore a bill you've never actually seen when the entire world feels, for the first time, like it's finally beginning. So you dragged your suitcase out into a foreign city, hopeful, wide awake, and quietly, invisibly, already in the red. The adventure was completely real. So was the meter, ticking away somewhere in an office you would rarely visit and never fully understand. Now let's discuss where you're actually going to sleep. In your head, it was a chic little studio apartment with a skyline view. In reality, you've been dropped into a cramped flat crowded with bunk beds and half a dozen other exhausted girls, all sharing one bathroom, one mirror, and one mysterious smell that nobody in the apartment will claim responsibility for. This is the model apartment, run by the agency, and it is most certainly not free. You're paying rent that would make a boutique hotel blush. for a mattress thinner than your own portfolio, and it's deducted from your pay before you ever hold a single bill in your hand. The model apartment was, in its own way, a small masterpiece of convenience, mostly for people who weren't the ones actually sleeping in it. The agency needed somewhere to house its constant rotating stream of teenagers arriving from every corner of the world, so it kept a handful of flats and packed them tight. For you, this meant you always had somewhere to land the moment you touched down. It also meant zero privacy, zero say in the matter, and no real escape from the arrangement once you were in it. Picture the layout: several rooms crammed with bunks, sometimes just mattresses laid wherever they'd physically fit. Girls coming and going at strange hours, some rushing out to early castings, some crawling back in from late-night shoots, every single one of them exhausted, nervous, and whether they admitted it aloud or not, quietly in competition with each other for the same small handful of jobs. It's a bit like summer camp. If summer camp charged premium rates and silently ranked all the campers against each other. The rent itself was the genuinely astonishing part. You might reasonably expect that sharing a lumpy bed in a crowded flat would be cheap. It was not. The agency charged handsomely for every single spot in that apartment, often well above what the space was actually worth on the open market. And since several girls were paying full rent for the exact same rooms simultaneously, the arithmetic worked out beautifully for everyone except the people who actually lived there. You couldn't simply shop around either. You couldn't announce that you'd found a cheaper, nicer place 3 blocks over and pack your things. The apartment was woven into the whole arrangement, tied to your visa, your schedule, your total dependence on the agency for practically everything. Leaving it felt complicated, was quietly discouraged, and carried a faint whiff of disloyalty, which is an enormous amount of pressure to put on a teenager who simply wanted 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep. And the rent, notably, was deducted before you ever saw your own earnings, a small phrase that hides an enormous trick. You never held your full paycheck and then chose, deliberately, to hand over rent money. The housing cost was skimmed silently off the top, so the only number you ever actually encountered was the smaller one left behind. It's far harder to resent a cost you never physically watch leave your own hand. Consider the tidy little circle this created. The agency found you, flew you over, and housed you, then charged you for that housing, deducting the payment directly from earnings it had also just taken a commission on. Money circled around and around inside the very same building, and somehow, at the end of every loop, there was a little less of it that actually belonged to you. There was, to be fair, a genuine strange comfort in that apartment too. You were surrounded by other girls living out the exact same bewildering existence. Exhaustion, rejection, homesickness, all of it shared. Friendships formed fast in those cramped little rooms, forged in shared misery and shared ambition, and that companionship was completely real. It made the whole ordeal survivable, some days barely. But make no mistake about what the model apartment actually was. It wasn't kindness dressed up as convenience. It was a business, wrapped neatly in bunk beds, charging premium prices for budget conditions to the very young people least equipped to argue about any of it. You had a roof over your head. You were simply paying through the nose for the privilege of resting underneath it. Before anyone will book you for a single job, you need a comp card, a glossy little rectangle printed with your best photographs and your exact measurements. Think of it as a business card, except it costs a genuinely startling amount of money, and you need hundreds of them at a time. You also need a portfolio, the actual book of images that proves to the industry you exist as a working professional. None of this arrives as a gift. Every print, every reprint is quietly charged to your account. So before you've earned a single dollar, you're already comfortably in the red. The comp card, everyone in the business simply called it a comp, was the basic currency of the working model. One side carried a striking image of your face. The other showed a handful of shots proving your range, alongside your statistics, height, measurements, and your agency's contact details. You handed these out at every casting the way other people hand out business cards, leaving a small glossy version of yourself behind in office after office. The trouble was pure arithmetic. You needed them by the hundreds because you were constantly giving them away and never getting a single one back. Printing them cost real money, and the moment your look changed even slightly, or your measurements shifted, or the agency simply decided to update your images, the old batch became instantly worthless, and a fresh print run had to be ordered. Each reprint was another quiet charge, another line added to a ledger you'd probably never actually see. Then there was the portfolio, your book, the heavy folder of your finest images that you carried physically to every single meeting. A good book required good photographs. Good photographs required real shoots. Shoots required photographers, stylists, makeup artists, film and studio time, all of it costing real money, and much of that money, one way or another, ended up being yours to cover. Notice the loop forming here. To land work, you needed to look professional. To look professional, you needed materials. To afford the materials, you needed work. It's an almost perfect circle, the kind that keeps you running furiously in place, spending money you don't have in pursuit of money you might never actually see. A snake elegantly eating its own tail and somehow still finding a way to bill you for the meal. None of these costs were ever framed as costs, naturally. They were framed as tools, as basic essentials, as the obvious price of being taken seriously in a competitive industry. And they weren't entirely wrong. You genuinely did need comp cards and a solid portfolio. But needing something doesn't make it cheap, and that very necessity was precisely what made the charges so difficult to push back against. Consider the real cruelty buried in the timing. All of this spending happened right at the very beginning, when you had earned absolutely nothing yet, when you were at your most vulnerable and least equipped to pay for anything. So you began your entire career already behind, the debt accumulating well before your income had any realistic chance of catching up. You were, in effect, paying an entrance fee for a party that might never actually let you inside. So that little glossy rectangle, so innocent looking in your hand, turned out to be one of the very first bricks in a growing wall of debt. It was small. It was necessary. It was everywhere. And every single one you handed across a desk whispered the exact same quiet message on its way out of your fingers. You owe us for this one too. Now the actual work begins, and it looks nothing like what you pictured. Most of your day is spent visiting people, hence the industry's cheerful little nickname for it, the go-see. You cross the entire city on foot or by train, clutching your heavy book, to stand in near silence while strangers flip through your photographs, glance up at your face and say almost nothing. Then you leave and you do it again. And again. You might sit through a dozen of these in a single day and book precisely none of them. It is rejection functioning as a full-time job, and absolutely nobody is paying for your bus fare. The go-see was the unglamorous engine driving the entire industry. Clients, photographers, and casting directors all needed to physically see a model before committing to hearing her, so they held these brisk little appointments where hopefuls filed through one after another after another. Every morning you receive a list, a scattering of addresses spread across the city, and off you went, on foot, on the subway, in whatever way you could afford, which usually meant the cheapest and slowest option available. Picture a typical appointment. You arrive to find a waiting room already crowded with girls who look eerily similar to you, every one of them clutching an identical heavy book, every one of them pretending not to be quietly sizing up the competition. Your name gets called. You walk in. Someone flips through your portfolio, perhaps asks you to walk a few steps across the room, perhaps says absolutely nothing at all, and then thanks you in a tone that unmistakably means goodbye. The entire exchange might last 90 seconds. Then you leave, and you cross the city to do it all again. The sheer volume of it was punishing. On a busy day, you might have 10 or 12 of these scattered across the map, each one demanding that you look fresh, energetic, and effortlessly lovely, regardless of how many trains you'd missed, or how badly your feet were already aching. It's a bit like applying for the exact same job over and over in person, all day long, and being judged mostly on whether your face happened to match whatever someone had pictured in their head that particular morning. And here's the part that really stings: none of it paid a cent. The go-see was unpaid labor, hours upon hours of it, the necessary groundwork that occasionally, rarely, led to an actual paying booking. You spent your own time, your own energy, and often your own transport money, all in hopes that one of these silent little appointments might eventually turn into a job. The industry called this opportunity. Your aching feet called it something considerably less polite. The rejection, meanwhile, was relentless, and it was delivered almost entirely through indifference. Nobody ever explained why you weren't chosen. You simply weren't the right height, the wrong look, not quite the vision somebody had pictured that particular morning, over and over, with no feedback to learn from and no real reason ever given. For a teenager, absorbing that volume of quiet rejection in a single afternoon was its own strange kind of endurance sport, one that gradually wore down even the most confident girls in the room. Consider the psychological trick quietly buried in all of this. Because bookings were so rare and precious, you began to feel a strange, disproportionate gratitude for any job at all, which made you far less likely to ever question your pay, your rent, or your steadily growing debt. Constant rejection is remarkably effective at manufacturing gratitude, and grateful people rarely complain about the invoice. There was a strange discipline that came out of it too, though. You learned the city fast, which trains ran where, at what hours, which shortcuts saved you 15 minutes. You grew a thicker skin and a bright, practiced smile you could summon on command. You became, out of sheer necessity, a small business of exactly one person, marketing yourself across an enormous, indifferent city with no salary and absolutely no guarantee of return. That resilience was real, and it was hard-earned. So the marathon continued, day after day, appointment after appointment, a blur of waiting rooms, flipping portfolio pages, and polite little dismissals. It was genuine, exhausting work that generated zero income while quietly costing you money to perform. And at the end of it, if you were lucky, one door out of 12 might crack open, just enough to keep you walking toward the next 11 tomorrow morning. Let's talk about test shoots. Early on, you need stronger photographs, so you do tests with newer photographers, and these are frequently unpaid, sold to you gently as an investment in building your book. Sometimes you even pay for the privilege outright, splitting the cost of film, studio rental, and a makeup artist who arrives late and leaves early. You're performing genuine labor that generates images for everyone else in the room, and somehow the only person who walks away lighter in the wallet is you. But it's for your future, they remind you. Your future, it turns out, is getting rather expensive. The test shoot lived in that strange overlap between real work and real expense. Everyone involved needed fresh material. The new photographer needed images to build his own portfolio. The makeup artist needed shots to demonstrate her skill. The stylist needed proof of his eye. And you needed strong new photographs for your book. So a small group of ambitious beginners gathered together, pooled their various talents, and produced photographs everyone could use afterward. In theory, this was perfectly fair, a scrappy trade among people all starting out, all needing exactly the same thing. In practice, though, the fairness had a habit of tilting quietly in one direction, because while the photographer kept his images and the makeup artist kept hers, you frequently ended up covering costs that nobody else on set did. Film, developing, studio rental, the small practical expenses of actually making the shoot happen landed disproportionately on the model, split unevenly or simply handed over outright. You were, in essence, paying to be photographed for everyone else's benefit. Consider the odd shape of that whole arrangement. You were performing real labor, standing under hot lights for hours, holding poses, taking direction, doing the actual job of modeling. And rather than being paid for that labor, you were sometimes paying for the privilege of performing it. Imagine showing up for a full shift at any ordinary job, and then handing your own boss $20 on your way out the door, simply for the honor of having shown up at all. The phrase that made all of this go down so smoothly was building your book. It quietly reframed unpaid, self-funded labor as an investment in yourself. That magical language again. You weren't working for nothing. You were building. You weren't losing money. You were investing in your own future. It's remarkable how much sting a carefully chosen word can remove from an otherwise empty wallet. And there was real truth buried underneath it, which is exactly what made it so effective. You genuinely did need those images. A weak book meant no bookings, and no bookings meant no career at all. The tests really did improve your portfolio. They really did sometimes lead directly to paid work. The necessity was real, which meant the expense felt less like exploitation and more like simple ambition, like doing whatever it took to make it. Think of it like an unpaid internship, that peculiar modern arrangement where eager young people work for nothing in exchange for experience and exposure. Except here, you sometimes went a step further, contributing not just your labor but your own cash, quietly funding the very shoots that were supposedly a favor being done for you. Exposure, as ever, remained stubbornly impossible to deposit at any bank. So the tests piled up shoot after shoot, image after image, each one nudging your book a little closer to something a real client might respect, and each one nudging your finances a little further into the red. You were slowly becoming a professional, one unpaid session at a time. The photographs grew stronger. Your bank balance did not. And through it all, the same comforting refrain kept playing that this was all for your future, a future which, so far, seemed to consist mostly of invoices. Time to talk about your body because everyone else certainly intends to. At any given moment, a stranger might produce a tape measure, wrap it around your hips or your waist, jot down a number, and exhale in a way that somehow ruins your entire week. You are weighed, assessed, and openly discussed as though you were livestock at a particularly fashionable auction. There is no privacy in it, and very little mercy. And the cruelest part is that the numbers everyone wants keep shifting. So you can be flawless on a Monday and, apparently, unbookable by Friday. Your body in this world was never really treated as your own. It was treated as the product itself, the merchandise being bought and sold. And so it was measured, inspected, and commented on by anyone with a professional-sounding reason to do so. Agents, clients, designers, casting directors all felt entirely entitled to know your exact dimensions and to react to them out loud, right in front of you, as though you weren't a full person standing 3 feet away. The measurements governed everything. There were standard sample sizes the industry expected, particularly for runway work, since the sample garments were cut to fit one very specific, very narrow set of numbers. If your hips ran even a couple of centimeters past what was expected, you could be quietly dropped from a booking, no matter how striking your face was, no matter how beautifully you walked. The tape measure, in the end, had far more power over your career than your actual talent ever did. Picture the routine humiliation of it. You stand perfectly still while somebody loops a tape around you, reads the number aloud or notes it silently with a small frown. Maybe they sigh. Maybe they trade a glance with a colleague across the room. Maybe they simply state the figure and let the disappointment hang there, unspoken. You've done absolutely nothing wrong. Your body has simply failed to match a chart, and the chart, apparently, is the thing that matters. And the truly impossible part was how the target itself kept drifting. Fashions in bodies shifted the same way fashions in clothing shifted, and what was desired one season could fall entirely out of favor the next, with no warning and no appeal process. You couldn't diet or train your way to permanent security, because there was no such thing as a permanent standard. Only the restless, ever-changing appetite of an industry that always seemed to want something slightly different from whatever you currently were. This constant scrutiny did something quietly corrosive to a very young person. When your entire livelihood depends on a stranger's tape measure, you begin watching your own body with a low, constant dread, seeing an ordinary meal as a risk, treating your own natural shape as a problem requiring management. It is an exhausting way to move through the world, permanently at odds with the very body you happen to live in. and it left real, lasting marks on a great many people who went through it. Consider how neatly this fed the larger machine. A model terrified of losing bookings over her own measurements is a model who will do almost anything to remain bookable, who will spend on trainers, on treatments, on whatever the moment happens to demand, and who will rarely, if ever, push back on her pay or her mounting debt. Fear of the tape measure kept you compliant, and compliance, as ever, turned out to be profitable for absolutely everyone except you. Think about how strange this would sound in any other line of work. A salary that depends on your waist measurement, checked weekly, judged publicly, with no consistency and no explanation offered. Most professions ask what you can actually do. This one asked, first and loudest, what you measured, and treated the answer as a verdict on your entire worth. So the tape measure followed you everywhere, this small strip of fabric wielding an enormous amount of power over your days. It decided which jobs you were even allowed to attempt, which garments you could fit into, whether the sigh across the desk would land as relief or as quiet disappointment. Your face may have opened the door in the first place, but your measurements decided whether you got to stay in the room, and they reserved the right to change their mind about you at any moment they pleased. Here is one of the great illusions of the era. You land a magazine editorial, maybe even a cover, the kind of image people frame and hang on their walls. Surely, you think, this must be the big payday. It is not. Editorial work, the glossy, career-making stuff, pays almost nothing, sometimes barely enough to cover a taxi and a sandwich. You do it for prestige, for exposure, for the promise that fame will eventually pay you back later. Exposure, you're slowly learning, does not cover rent. And the rent, need we remind you, belongs entirely to your agency. The magazine editorial sat right at the very top of the industry's ladder of respect, and almost at the bottom of its ladder of pay. This seems backward until you understand exactly what trade was being offered. The magazines understood perfectly well that appearing in their pages made a model desirable, credible, sought after, so they paid in prestige rather than cash. And they got away with it because prestige genuinely was valuable, just not in any form you could actually spend at a grocery store. Picture the disconnect plainly. You shoot a stunning editorial for a genuinely famous magazine, spend a full, grueling day being styled and photographed by celebrated names in the business, and the resulting images turn out breathtaking, the kind that make your family gasp with pride and your peers quietly envious. Then you receive your payment, and it is a startlingly modest sum. A day rate so small it feels almost like a joke, barely enough to cover the cab ride that got you there in the first place. The logic offered was always identical. This exposure will lead to bigger things down the road. Being seen in these particular pages will bring the lucrative bookings, the advertising campaigns, the contracts that actually pay real money. And sometimes, for a fortunate few, that promise genuinely came true. The editorial really was a doorway, and occasionally it led somewhere golden. But a doorway is not a paycheck, and nobody has ever managed to eat a maybe. Here is the trap folded neatly inside all that prestige. The editorials that built your entire reputation paid you almost nothing, and yet you needed to keep doing them to become valuable enough to eventually earn real money elsewhere. So you poured your time and energy into beautiful, famous, essentially unpaid work, all while your rent, your comp cards, and your advances kept demanding actual cash you simply did not have. The more prestigious your career appeared from the outside, the more quietly broke you could actually become. Consider how neatly this served everybody positioned above you. The magazines got gorgeous images for a pittance. The agency got a model whose growing fame might eventually land a genuinely lucrative contract from which they would take their usual commission. And you got the honor, the clippings, the growing name recognition, and a bank balance that stubbornly refused to reflect any of it whatsoever. Fame flowed upward and outward. The actual money mostly didn't flow anywhere near you. It's a bit like being a brilliant young chef invited to cook at the world's most celebrated restaurants for free, because the honor of standing in that particular kitchen is apparently payment enough on its own. The reviews are glowing. Your name starts to travel, And you go home every single night wondering exactly how you're going to afford groceries, clutching a stack of prestigious mentions that no landlord anywhere has ever accepted in lieu of rent. The word exposure did the heaviest lifting of all here, as it so often does for the chronically underpaid. Exposure sounds like a gift, like sunlight, like something that will surely nourish you eventually. In practice, it meant working for the promise of some future reward, a promise that materialized for only a tiny handful and never for most. You were rich in exposure and poor in absolutely everything you could actually use to survive. So you smiled for the cover, dazzling, famous, celebrated, took your tiny check, and went home to your bunk in that crowded apartment whose rent was quietly eating you alive. Your image would hang on newsstands around the entire world, visible proof of your success. And you would look at it, proud and genuinely baffled, wondering how something so glamorous could leave you holding so little. So how exactly are you surviving if Editorial pays in little more than pocket lint? The agency generously offers you an advance, a little cash up front to cover your rent, your comp cards, your flights, your groceries. How kind, how generous, how thoroughly, completely not free. Every single dollar they front you becomes a dollar you now officially owe them back, meticulously logged in a ledger you almost never actually get to see. The advance felt like a genuine lifeline in the moment it arrived. In truth, it was the quiet opening chapter of a debt that would follow you around like a very well-dressed shadow for years. The advance solved a real pressing problem, which is precisely why it worked so well as a mechanism. Your expenses started the very day you arrived. Your income trickled in slowly and unpredictably, often months behind the work that had actually earned it. So there was a gap, a genuine chasm between what you owed and what you actually had in hand. And into that exact gap, the agency stepped forward with an offer of help. You needed that help genuinely. You needed to eat. You needed your comp cards reprinted. You needed rent covered so you wouldn't be tossed out of the crowded apartment onto the street. When someone throws a rope to a drowning person, the drowning person does not typically pause to inspect it closely for knots. You took the advance because you had no other realistic option, and gratitude in that particular moment drowned out any lingering caution. But an advance, no matter how warmly it's offered, is still a loan, and every loan eventually demands repayment. So each dollar the agency handed you was carefully logged as a dollar you now owed, to be quietly collected from your future earnings before you ever laid eyes on them. The money didn't lift you out of the hole you were in. It simply moved the walls of that hole a little closer together and handed you an invoice for the renovation. The ledger tracking all of this was the quiet villain of the entire story. You rarely got to see it clearly. You weren't sitting down monthly reviewing a tidy statement of what you'd earned against what you'd borrowed. The numbers lived entirely inside the agency's own books, tallied by the agency's own staff, presented to you only in glimpses, if at all. You were in debt to the very people who controlled the only existing record of exactly how much you owed. Consider the trap tightening around you. To repay the advance, you needed to earn more. To earn, you needed to keep working through the very agency you owed money to. And while you worked, your ongoing expenses kept requiring further advances, which added to the debt, which required still more earning, which bound you ever tighter to the same people you already owed. The rope that had saved you had quietly become a leash. It's a bit like an old company town, where the workers were technically paid, but the housing, the shop, and all the available credit belonged entirely to the company itself. So wages simply flowed right back to the employer, and the workers stayed perpetually, gently in debt. You could work as hard as humanly possible and still never quite get ahead, because the ground kept shifting beneath you to ensure you kept owing. The genius of it, if you can even call it genius, was how kind the entire thing felt while it was happening. Nobody strong-armed you. Nobody threatened you outright. They helped you generously, in your exact moment of need, and the help itself was the very mechanism that held you in place. It is remarkably difficult to resent a leash when it was handed to you as a lifeline, by smiling people who kept calling you family. So you took the advances again and again because the alternative was hunger and eviction. And each time you did, the shadow trailing behind you grew a little longer. The money felt like rescue every single time it arrived. And every single time, it deepened the debt a little further, tightened the knot, and quietly ensured that no matter how many magazine covers eventually carried your face, you would keep waking up in that same bunk bed, working furiously to repay the very help that kept you there in the first place. Let's revisit that itemized statement, because it deserves its own reckoning. There are charges for messengers who physically carried your book across the city, charges for phone calls, charges for couriers, for taxis, for the courier who apparently delivered the receipt for the taxi. Every tiny convenience of your working life had quietly transformed into a line item with your name attached to it. It is death by 1,000 small deductions, and by the time you actually add them all up, you realize you've essentially been billed for the privilege of existing inside your own career. The genius of the small charge is that no single one is ever worth fighting over. A messenger fee is a modest, forgettable thing. A phone charge, a courier cost, cab fare to a casting, each one small enough to simply shrug off, small enough that objecting to it would feel almost petty. And that was precisely the point. The individual charges were forgettable. It was only their steady accumulation, month after month, item after tiny item, that quietly hollowed out your entire paycheck. Consider the sheer variety of things that could appear on your running account. Messengers ferrying your portfolio between offices, because your book had to travel constantly and someone had to physically carry it. Phone bills, back when long calls cost genuine money and the agency's lines were used liberally on your behalf. Couriers delivering documents, taxis to urgent last-minute castings, countless other small services rendered in your name and quietly billed straight to your ledger. You rarely saw these charges as they actually happened. They were logged somewhere deep in the agency's records, accumulating quietly out of sight, presented to you much later as one lump total you could neither remember agreeing to nor easily dispute. How exactly do you argue with a courier fee from 3 months ago that you never personally authorized and cannot possibly verify? You don't. You simply absorb it, one more small weight added to an already growing pile. Consider the imbalance of information sitting at the very heart of all this. The agency knew precisely what you owed. They tracked every deduction. They held every single record. You knew almost nothing, saw only occasional glimpses, and had no practical way whatsoever to audit the arithmetic yourself. When one party keeps all the books and the other party simply has to trust them, the trusting party tends to end up on the losing end of every single rounding error. It's a bit like a hotel minibar, where every tiny item carries a startling price tag, and the full bill only arrives at the very end, long after you've forgotten the 2 a.m. moment of weakness that led to those absurdly expensive cashews. Except in your case, the minibar was your entire working life, and nearly everything you touched turned out to carry a price tag you'd never actually seen coming. So the statement grew, line by tiny line, a quiet monument to the countless small costs of simply being a working model. Individually, each one was nothing at all. Together, they represented a genuine small fortune, drawn steadily out of your pocket for the ongoing, expensive privilege of doing your own job. Here is the trick that truly stings once you finally understand how it works. Your agency takes a healthy slice of your earnings as commission, fair enough, on its face. They found you the work, after all. But the agency very often also charges the client a separate fee on the very same booking, sometimes just as large. So the money generated by a single job gets nibbled at from both ends before the leftover crumbs ever reach you. You are the goose laying the golden eggs, and somehow the farmer has found a way to bill you for the straw, the barn, and the eggs all at once. Start with the commission you'd naturally expect, the one taken from your side of the ledger. When you booked a job, the agency kept a percentage of your fee as payment for representing you. This part is normal, unremarkable, exactly how agents everywhere earn their keep. They found the client, negotiated the deal, handled the paperwork, and took a cut for their trouble. So far, entirely reasonable. But here comes the part most young models never even noticed. The agency also charged the client a separate, additional fee, often calculated right on top of your day rate, sometimes quietly labeled a service charge. So the client actually paid more than your fee alone, and out of your fee, the agency then subtracted its own commission before passing along whatever remained. The agency had now been paid twice on a single booking, once by the client and once by you, while you had been paid exactly once, minus deductions. Picture the money actually flowing. A client wants you for a job and agrees to a rate. On top of that rate, the agency tacks on its own separate charge to the client, so the client pays noticeably more than your quoted fee. Then, from your fee specifically, the agency subtracts its commission before handing you the remainder. Consider what this meant for the true economics of your entire career. The headline number everyone gossiped about was never actually what you received. It was chipped away at from your side by commission, and inflated on the client's side by a service charge you never even saw. The real cost of hearing you was always higher than your pay, and the real amount you kept was always lower than your fee. You lived permanently inside the shrinking gap between those two very different figures. It's a bit like selling handmade goods through a shop that takes a cut of your price and separately charges the customer a handling fee on top. So the shop profits twice while you profit exactly once. You made the thing. You did the actual work. And the middleman standing between you and the buyer found two entirely separate ways to get paid for the same single sale. So every job you booked fed the agency from two directions simultaneously. A slice taken from you, and a slice taken from the client, both drawn from the exact same pool of value your own labor had created. You were the goose faithfully laying the golden eggs. And the arrangement quietly ensured that no matter how many eggs you produced, the farmer always somehow ended up holding most of the gold. It's Fashion Week, a charming way of saying you're about to lose your mind across 4 countries in a row. New York, then London, then Milan, then Paris, one immediately after the other, a blur of fittings, castings, and catwalks. You will change outfits more times in a single hour than most people manage in an entire month. You will barely sleep. You will eat standing up if you eat at all. And every flight, every hotel room, every last-minute booking is stacking neatly onto your account while you stumble, half-conscious, down runway after runway. The Fashion Week circuit was the industry running at its most frantic possible pace. The major capitals held their shows one right after another, so the entire traveling caravan, models, designers, editors, hangers-on, moved together across the map, straight from one exhausting week into the next without pause. For roughly a month, your entire existence became airports, fittings, and the relentless rhythm of the runway, with barely a breath in between. Picture the pace of a single show day. You arrive for fittings, where garments are pinned and adjusted directly to your frame. You wait seemingly forever for your turn. Your hair and makeup get transformed into whatever vision the designer currently demands. You walk the runway, a brief, blazing moment after hours of preparation, then rush straight to the next show, and the one after that, sometimes several in a single day, each one requiring an entirely new look from scratch. The changing alone was dizzying. Backstage during a show, you might have mere seconds to strip out of one outfit and into the next, garments swarming around you, safety pins flying past your face, someone shoving shoes onto your feet as you're already moving toward the runway entrance. You change clothes more times in a single afternoon than an ordinary person manages in an entire month, all while projecting serene, effortless composure the instant you step into the lights. Sleep, meanwhile, became something closer to a rumor. Between the shows, the parties you were expected to attend, the flights between cities, and the constant fittings, there was simply no room left for actual rest. You survived on fragments of sleep snatched on planes and in the backs of cars, running purely on adrenaline, caffeine, and sheer momentum. Your body genuinely didn't know what time zone it currently occupied, and nobody ever gave it the chance to find out. Now consider the cost of all that glamorous motion. 4 cities in 4 weeks meant 4 separate sets of flights, hotels, and transfers, much of it booked at the very last minute, all of it expensive. And whose account did these costs land on? Yours, naturally, stacking up as you moved, the debt traveling alongside you from capital to capital, growing a little with every single takeoff and every hotel checkout. The shows themselves, remember, often paid remarkably little, sometimes in clothing rather than actual cash. So you were spending heavily just to participate in prestigious events that barely paid anything at all, chasing the visibility and credibility that runway work supposedly conferred. The entire circuit was, financially speaking, a strange kind of loss leader, a costly investment in your own name, funded entirely out of a wallet already stretched to its absolute limit. It's a bit like being invited to compete in the world's most prestigious tournament across 4 different countries back-to-back, entirely at your own expense, for trophies that look magnificent and pay almost nothing at all. The honor was immense, the exhaustion was total, and the bill quietly belonged to you. So you flew and fitted and walked and changed and flew again, a month-long marathon of glamour performed on almost no sleep, and someone else's schedule entirely. The photographs looked spectacular. The world saw poise and beauty gliding effortlessly down runway after runway. What the world never saw was the exhausted teenager standing behind that poise, half asleep on her feet, quietly accumulating debt with every dazzling, unpaid step. Let's talk about the runway itself now. It looks, from the outside, like the absolute pinnacle of glamour, and in some ways it genuinely is. But the truly prestigious designer shows often pay astonishingly little, sometimes in clothing instead of cash, as though a free jacket might somehow cover your rent for the month. You risk your ankles in heels engineered by someone with a personal grudge against the human foot. You hold your face in an expression of practiced, regal boredom. And you do it all for the honor being, as it turns out, a wonderful currency that no bank on earth will accept as a deposit. The runway occupied a strange, almost contradictory position in the economics of modeling. It was the most visible, most photographed, most talked about form of the work, the thing that made a designer's collection famous and a model's face instantly recognizable. And yet, precisely because it was so prestigious, so fiercely coveted, the shows could get away with paying almost nothing. When absolutely everyone wants a spot in the lineup, you don't need to pay much to fill it. Consider the strange currency of the catwalk itself. For the most prestigious houses, a model might receive only a modest fee, or sometimes be paid partly or entirely in garments pulled straight from the collection, in lieu of proper money. A designer jacket is a genuinely lovely thing to own. It does not, however, pay your rent, feed you dinner, or shrink the debt sitting patiently in the agency's ledger. You cannot hand your landlord a beautiful coat and call the account settled. The physical demands of the runway, meanwhile, were no small thing either. The shoes were frequently architectural marvels of pure discomfort, towering, unstable, seemingly designed by someone who had never once owned a pair of actual feet. You had to walk in them with total, unwavering confidence, spine straight, gaze cool and distant, betraying absolutely no hint of the agony happening several inches below your ankles. A stumble on the runway could be humiliating and genuinely career-damaging, so the pressure to glide flawlessly in torturous footwear was intense, every single time. And then there was the face. The runway demanded a very particular expression, aloof, unbothered, a mask of regal indifference that had nothing whatsoever to do with how you actually felt in that moment, which was usually exhausted, hungry, and quietly terrified of falling in front of several hundred people. You performed serenity while your ankles screamed and your stomach growled audibly, projecting effortless superiority for an audience that would never guess at the effort, or the empty wallet, sitting quietly just beneath the surface. Why do it at all, then, if it paid so poorly? Because the runway made you. Walking for the right designers built your reputation, put you directly in front of the industry's most influential eyes, and could eventually lead to the genuinely lucrative work waiting further down the road, the advertising campaigns, the real contracts. So you accepted the tiny fees and the free jackets as an investment in your own future visibility, betting on a payoff that most girls in that lineup would never actually collect. It's a bit like a genuinely talented musician playing the most prestigious venues in the world for little more than the promise of simply being seen there. The stage is legendary, the audience is important, and the performer goes home with a handshake, a glowing mention in the program, and a bank account that hasn't moved an inch. Prestige, it turns out, is a currency everyone respects deeply, and absolutely no shop on earth accepts as payment. The clothing as payment arrangement was perhaps the purest expression of the whole absurdity. You gave a full day of skilled, physically punishing labor, and in exchange you were handed a garment, as though beauty and fame were somehow their own reward, and actual money would only cheapen the art of the thing. The garment was real, and often genuinely gorgeous. It was also completely useless for the very practical business of staying alive. So you walked, magnificent and quietly broke, down the most celebrated runways on the planet, in shoes that hurt and clothes you occasionally got to keep instead of a paycheck. The honor was genuine. The visibility was invaluable. The images became immortal. And your finances, entirely unmoved by any of it, kept sliding quietly in the wrong direction, one glorious, unpaid step at a time. Time to talk about your body clock, which at this point no longer recognizes the concept of a clock at all. You're constantly airborne, chasing bookings from one continent to the next, waking up at 3 in the morning fully convinced it's lunchtime. You live out of a suitcase that has started to smell faintly of every airport on Earth. There is no rest built into any of this, no gentle pause to recover, because a resting model is a model who isn't earning, and a model who isn't earning is a model whose debt keeps quietly growing while she sleeps. So you don't sleep, you fly. The international nature of the work meant your entire career was scattered across the globe, and so, inevitably, were you, forever in motion between whichever cities happened to hold the money and the jobs that week. A booking in one country, a casting in another, a show in a third, all of it demanding you stay constantly on the move, chasing opportunity across time zones like a traveler who has simply forgotten where home ever was. The jet lag was relentless, and worse, it was cumulative. Your body never got the chance to settle into any single rhythm before being hauled straight into another one. You'd land somewhere, work almost immediately, then fly out again before you'd even adjusted. So you existed in a kind of permanent fog, wide awake exactly when you should have been sleeping, and desperately drowsy exactly when you needed to shine on camera. 3 in the morning found you wide-eyed and ravenous. Midday found you desperate simply to collapse somewhere quiet. Living out of a suitcase became your entire normal. You never fully unpacked anywhere, never truly arrived anywhere in any lasting sense, just moved from hotel to model apartment to airport and back again. Your whole life compressed into a single bag that had, by this point, visited more countries than most people manage in an entire lifetime. There was no home base to return to, no room that was reliably, consistently yours, just a rotating series of temporary places, and the constant, low-grade disorientation of never quite knowing which city you'd wake up in next. The reason there was never any rest built into the schedule was simple and cold. Rest didn't earn anything. Every single day you spent recovering was a day you weren't working, and every day you weren't working was a day your expenses kept quietly mounting while your income sat paused. The debt never took a holiday. The rent came due whether you worked or slept. So resting felt like falling behind, and falling behind felt genuinely dangerous. So you kept moving, even when your entire body was begging you to stop. Consider the trap folded into that logic. The very exhaustion that made you desperate for rest had been produced by a system that punished rest financially. To catch up on your debt, you had to keep working. To keep working, you had to keep flying. To keep flying, you had to keep ignoring a deep, bone-level tiredness that the constant travel produced in the first place. The faster you ran, the more running the whole system demanded of you. This ceaseless motion also kept you dependent and disoriented in ways that quietly served the agency's interests. A model who is perpetually exhausted, perpetually jet-lagged, perpetually uncertain what city she's even standing in, is not a model with the spare energy to scrutinize her contracts or push back on her charges. Depletion, it turns out, is a wonderful tool for keeping someone compliant. It's genuinely hard to advocate for yourself when you can barely remember what day of the week it is. It's a bit like a traveling salesperson who only gets paid while actually on the road, so they can never quite afford to go home. And so they drive on through the night, year after year, growing more depleted with every single mile, unable to stop precisely because stopping is the one thing they cannot financially afford. Motion becomes both the job itself and the prison surrounding it. So you flew and flew and flew again. Your body clock shattered, your suitcase battered, your entire sense of time dissolved into a smear of departure lounges and takeoffs. The glamour from the outside looked like the freedom to see the whole world. The reality was a compulsion to keep crossing it, sleepless and disoriented, because the moment you stopped moving, the debt would catch right up to you, and you simply couldn't afford to let that happen. Let's gently address the subject of food, or the strange, near-total absence of it. The industry had decided, constantly and cruelly, exactly what your body should look like, and that particular vision rarely seemed to include lunch. Around you, people discussed eating as though it were some kind of moral failing. You survived on black coffee, cigarettes handed to you like party favors, and the occasional secret snack eaten with the guilt of a criminal caught red-handed. It is a genuinely bleak way to fuel a job that demands you glow. And yes, somehow, even the coffee ended up on your bill. The relationship between the industry and food was, to put it as kindly as possible, deeply troubled. Because your body itself was the product, and because the desired shape of that product was extremely, sometimes impossibly thin, eating became fraught with pressure and quiet shame. You were surrounded constantly by a culture that treated hunger as discipline and treated an actual meal as a personal weakness. And as a very young person, you absorbed that culture whether you consciously wanted to or not. Picture the atmosphere backstage and inside those crowded apartments. Food was discussed constantly, but almost never as nourishment. It was framed instead as a threat, a temptation, something to be resisted or actively feared. Someone might comment on what you had or hadn't eaten, with a single raised eyebrow that said far more than any actual words could. In an environment where a couple of centimeters could genuinely cost you a booking, the message was clear, and it was reinforced everywhere you turned. So you learned to run on almost nothing. Coffee became a full meal in itself, a way to feel simultaneously full and awake. Cigarettes were everywhere, offered casually, quietly encouraged as a kind of appetite suppressant, a way to keep your hands occupied and your stomach quiet at the same time. Actual food, real sustenance, became something you approached with genuine anxiety, often eaten secretly and quickly, with a guilt entirely out of proportion to the simple human act of feeding yourself. This was, of course, a terrible way to fuel a genuinely demanding job. Modeling required real energy and stamina, hours of standing under blazing hot lights, long days of travel and fittings, and shows back to back. Your body was being asked to perform, to glow, to project health and vitality, all while being systematically starved of the very fuel it actually needed to do any of it. You were expected to look radiant on a diet that would leave almost anyone dim and exhausted. The toll of all this went far beyond a simple rumbling stomach. Living in a constant state of hunger and food anxiety did lasting harm, both physically and mentally, to a great many people who passed through this industry. It taught young bodies to fear food itself, and young minds to quietly equate their own worth with thinness. These were not minor discomforts to shrug off. For a great many people, they became serious, lifelong struggles that far outlasted any modeling career. We should tread a little carefully here, because this is genuinely heavy ground. The disordered relationship with food that the industry so routinely encouraged caused real, lasting damage to real people. Beneath the wry tone of tonight's telling, it's worth remembering that these were teenagers effectively being taught to starve themselves, and that the consequences of that particular lesson were sometimes severe and long-lasting. There was a grim absurdity to the economics of it, too. Even your coffee, that meager fuel keeping you upright, could somehow find its way onto your account. The small costs of your working life came back to you, as they always did. You were paying, one way or another, for the very caffeine keeping you functional through a day you were far too underfed to properly face otherwise. So you glowed on camera and quietly starved off it, projecting effortless vitality while running on caffeine, cigarettes, and guilt. The images showed the world a picture of perfect health and beauty. The reality was a young person taught to fear her own hunger, performing radiance on an empty stomach, in a job that demanded she shine while quietly denying her the fuel to do it. Now put on something dazzling, because tonight you have to be seen. The parties, the openings, the dinners where flashbulbs pop and important people press their cheek near yours without quite touching it. Technically, all of this counts as your job. You're building your image, staying relevant, being famous in public, but nobody actually pays you to show up. You pay in time, in exhaustion, in the smile you have to keep welded to your face at midnight, when you trade a kidney for your terrible little bunk bed. Glamour, as it turns out, is a second shift. The social side of modeling was never really optional, however much it might have looked like pure leisure from the outside. Being seen at the right events, next to the right people, kept your name alive, and your face current in a business obsessed with relevance above almost everything else. The parties weren't a reward for your work. They were an extension of it, labor dressed up as fun, unpaid but fully expected all the same. Picture the demands of an evening that is really, quietly, a shift on the clock. You have to look flawless, which takes real time, effort, and often money. You have to be charming, engaged, delightful company, no matter how drained you actually feel underneath it. You have to be photographed looking effortless, greet exactly the right people, be visibly part of the scene, and you have to do all of this after a full day of castings, shoots, or shows, when every cell in your body is quietly begging for sleep. The cheek kisses and the flashing cameras created an illusion of belonging, of being an honored guest at some glamorous private gathering. But you weren't quite a guest. You were part of the spectacle itself, a decorative, necessary element of the scene, expected to attend and perform sociability on command. The important people brushing cheeks with you weren't really your friends. They were your context, and you were theirs, and none of it paid a single cent. There was no fee for attending a party, no wage for being charming at dinner. You gave your evening, your energy, your carefully assembled glamour, all for the intangible benefit of simply staying visible. It was labor that cost you and paid you nothing, justified once again by the promise that being seen would eventually, somehow, lead to being paid. Consider the exhaustion this layered onto an already punishing schedule. Your days were completely full of work. Your evenings, which any ordinary employee might use to actually rest, were often full of this exact second, social shift. The smile you wore at midnight was every bit as much a part of your job as the pose you struck on set that morning, and it was every bit as effortful, every bit as performed, and considerably less rewarded. The relentlessness of it wore people down over time. There was no clear boundary anywhere between working and simply living. No moment when you were genuinely off the clock, because being seen resting badly, or not being seen at all, carried a real professional risk. It's a bit like a job that expects you to attend a networking event every single night, unpaid, informal wear, after already working a full day, and to appear thrilled about it, because your entire career quietly depends on your enthusiasm. The champagne is free. Your time, your energy, and your rest most certainly are not, and you're spending all three at once. So you dressed, and smiled, and glittered your way through evening after evening, performing a glamorous life for an audience that mistook the performance for the actual reality. The photographs suggested a charmed existence of endless parties. What they never captured was the bone-deep tiredness sitting quietly behind the smile, or the simple, aching wish at midnight to finally be allowed to go home to that terrible little bunk and just sleep. Here, at last, is where the real money lives, if you're one of the lucky few. A cosmetics company or a fragrance house offers you a contract to become their face, and suddenly the numbers grow genuinely enormous, the kind of figures that end up printed in newspapers. This is where the millions in tonight's title actually live. This is the real dream. But these particular contracts go to an almost impossibly tiny handful of names sitting right at the top of the pyramid, and getting there requires absolutely everything to align perfectly. For most, the golden ticket stays glittering, permanently just out of reach. The beauty contract was the genuine prize, the thing separating the wealthy few from the working many. When a major cosmetics or fragrance house chose a model to be its face, it wanted exclusivity and continuity, a single recognizable figure to represent the brand across years of advertising. And for that kind of commitment, it was willing to pay sums that dwarfed anything Editorial or Runway work could ever offer, the enormous figures that made headlines and built legends. Picture the difference this made in practice. Where a magazine cover paid in prestige and pocket change, a beauty contract paid in the kind of money that genuinely changes a life. These were multi-year deals worth extraordinary sums, providing something almost unheard of anywhere else in this business: a steady, substantial, reliable income. This was where the millions genuinely lived, the financial bedrock underneath the era's most famous names. But here lies the crucial catch. These contracts were vanishingly rare. A single brand needed only one face, and there were only so many major brands to go around. So the number of these golden deals available at any given moment stayed tiny, reserved for the handful of models who'd reached the absolute pinnacle, whose fame and features happened to align perfectly with whatever a major brand wanted to project that particular season. For everyone below that peak, the contract remained a distant, glittering possibility. Getting there required an almost impossible alignment of factors. You needed exactly the right look for exactly the right brand at exactly the right moment. You needed the fame to justify the investment, the reputation, the relationships, and no small amount of luck. Talent and beauty alone weren't enough, because thousands of girls possessed both in abundance. You needed to be somehow the exact person a powerful company decided to build its entire image around, at the precise moment it happened to be choosing. Consider what this meant for the vast majority working underneath that peak. Most working models, even genuinely successful ones with steady bookings and recognizable faces, never landed a major beauty contract in their entire careers. They spent their working years in the busy, underpaid middle, doing the editorials, the shows, the catalog work, watching the golden tickets go, year after year, to the rare few standing above them. The dream was completely real, and it was real for almost nobody. The existence of these contracts served an interesting purpose within the whole system. They were the shining example held up constantly to justify everything else that happened beneath them. Proof that fabulous wealth really was possible, that all the unpaid go-sees and cheap editorials and mounting debt might one day pay off spectacularly. The golden ticket glittering at the top kept everyone underneath striving, spending, and enduring, chasing a prize that only a tiny handful would ever actually hold. It's a bit like a lottery with a genuinely enormous jackpot. The jackpot is real, and someone genuinely does win it, which is exactly what keeps everyone else buying tickets. The visible success of the very few obscures the quiet, ordinary losing of the very many, and makes the long odds feel somehow like they might just bend in your particular favor. So the beauty contract glittered at the summit of the whole profession, the answer to the question posed in tonight's title, the place where the millions truly lived. For a rare few, it delivered wealth beyond imagining. For most, it stayed a beautiful, distant light, the dream that kept them walking the runways and enduring the debt, always just out of reach, always promising that next season, perhaps, the golden ticket might finally turn out to be theirs. Let's talk about the great illusion of the entire era. The world sees a small cluster of famous faces, the ones who need only a single name and a fragrance deal, and assumes every working model lives exactly like that. But underneath those few sit thousands of working models grinding through go-see after go-see, doing editorials that pay in little more than sandwiches, stuck in rent they can't escape. For every household name, there's an army of hopeful girls quietly going broke. You are sold the very top of the pyramid. Statistically, you are standing somewhere near the bottom looking up. The public image of the era was dominated entirely by a tiny handful of women so famous they needed only one name, whose faces sold magazines and whose fees made front-page headlines. They were completely real. They were spectacular, and they genuinely did earn fortunes. But they were also profoundly unrepresentative, the glittering tip of an enormous, mostly invisible structure the world rarely bothered to look beneath. Picture the true shape of the profession as an actual pyramid. At the very top sit the handful of superstar names, wealthy and celebrated, holding their beauty contracts and their newspaper-worthy fees. Just below them, a somewhat larger group doing very well, but not quite legendary. And below that, spreading wider and wider toward the base, thousands upon thousands of working models grinding away in relative obscurity, most of them simply struggling to break even at the end of the month. The women at the base were not failures, to be clear. Many were talented, beautiful, and genuinely employed, booking real jobs and appearing in real publications. They simply weren't stars, and in this particular business, only the stars got rich. They lived the entire life described throughout tonight's journey, the go-sees, the cheap editorials, the overpriced apartments, the mounting debt, all of it, minus the enormous paydays that supposedly made the whole arrangement worthwhile for the lucky few at the peak. Consider how carefully the illusion was maintained. The famous faces were everywhere, on covers, on screens, in the daily news. So the public naturally assumed this was what being a model actually meant. Fabulous wealth, endless glamour, total ease. The thousands working at the base stayed invisible precisely because they weren't famous, so nobody ever saw the ordinary, broke reality that quietly defined the vast majority of the profession. This illusion wasn't accidental, and it proved extraordinarily useful. It kept a steady stream of hopeful young people flowing into the business, each one imagining herself eventually standing at the top of the pyramid, each one willing to endure the unpaid work and the debt and the exhaustion, because the visible rewards looked so enormous from a distance. The dazzling few at the peak recruited the striving many at the base without even trying. It's a bit like looking at the champions of a great competition and assuming everyone who entered lives exactly like them. The champions are real. Their victory is real. But behind each one stand countless competitors who trained just as hard, sacrificed just as much, and went home with nothing but the experience and a stack of bills. The visible winners hide the invisible many standing behind them. Standing somewhere in that vast base, you had been sold a picture of the summit. The scout who found you, the agency that signed you, the whole culture surrounding you had shown you the famous faces and let you believe that path was simply yours for the walking. It might have been, for a rare, fortunate few. But the arithmetic of the pyramid meant that statistically, you were far more likely to spend your entire career looking up at the peak than ever standing on it. So the great illusion held, beautiful and durable, the shining top obscuring the struggling bottom. The world saw a handful of wealthy legends and imagined an entire profession built in their image. And the reality, thousands grinding through the unglamorous middle and bottom, quietly going broke chasing a summit most would never reach, remained exactly what it had always been. The part of the pyramid nobody bothered to show you. Now let's talk about timing, the silent assassin of your finances. When you finally book a genuinely well-paying job, the money does not simply appear. Clients pay slowly, sometimes 90 days later, sometimes considerably longer, drifting through a maze of paperwork somewhere behind the scenes. But your expenses never wait for anyone. Rent, comp cards, flights, advances, all of it comes due now today, immediately. So you're perpetually poor while technically being owed a small fortune, living in the miserable gap between the work you already did and the check that stubbornly refuses to arrive. The delay between working and actually being paid was one of the quietest, most punishing features of the entire business. When a client hired you, they didn't hand over cash at the end of the shoot. The payment traveled slowly through their accounting department, then to the agency, then, eventually, in theory, to you, a journey that could take months and sometimes stretched considerably longer than that. Picture the strange limbo this created. You could finish a genuinely lucrative job, worth a substantial sum on paper, and walk away that day with absolutely nothing in your hand. On paper, you were owed a great deal. In your actual pocket, you had the same emptiness as always. The wealth existed, technically, but it hovered somewhere in the future, tangled up in invoices and processing, refusing to become anything you could actually use to buy groceries. Meanwhile, your own costs observed no such delays whatsoever. Rent came due on schedule every single month. Your comp cards needed reprinting. Your flights had to be booked in advance. The advances you'd already taken demanded repayment on their own schedule. All of these expenses lived firmly in the present tense, insistent and immediate, while your income drifted somewhere off in the hazy distance, endlessly promising to arrive eventually. So you lived in that gap, the miserable stretch between doing the work and actually receiving the reward for it. And the gap had to be filled with something, which is exactly where the advances came galloping back in. Because your money was delayed, you needed to borrow against it just to survive the wait, which meant taking more advances, which meant more debt, which meant an ever larger portion of your eventual payment was already spoken for before it even arrived. Consider how neatly this fed the entire machine. The slow payments created a constant, ongoing need for advances. The advances created debt. The debt kept you bound tightly to the agency. So the timing itself, whether by deliberate design or simply by the nature of the business, worked quietly to keep you dependent, always borrowing against money you had genuinely earned but could not yet actually touch. It's a bit like being handed a winning lottery ticket that cannot be cashed for a full year, while your bills keep piling up today. You are technically rich. You're also, practically speaking, completely broke, forced to borrow against your own certain future fortune just to keep the lights on, watching interest quietly nibble away at winnings you haven't even held yet. The uncertainty made all of it considerably worse. Payments didn't arrive on any reliable schedule you could plan around. They came late, then later still, drifting through the paperwork at their own unhurried pace. So you could never quite predict when relief might actually show up. This made budgeting nearly impossible and anxiety nearly constant, since you never knew whether this month's money would appear in time to matter. This delay also handed a quiet advantage to the people holding your money. While your payment sat somewhere in the pipeline, it wasn't working for you at all. You bore all the pressure of the wait, all the need to borrow, all the anxiety of the gap, while the funds moved slowly through hands other than your own. So you did the work, earned the fee, and then waited and waited, perpetually poor in the shadow of a fortune you were technically owed. The money was real. It was simply always somewhere else, always arriving next month, next quarter, next year, while you scraped by in the present on borrowed cash and dwindling hope. Time for the joys of working internationally, which is a delightful way of losing money in several different currencies simultaneously. You earn in one country, get taxed in another, and try to convert it all in a third, while nobody bothers explaining the actual rules to you. Foreign bookings mean foreign paperwork, foreign fees, and foreign confusion, all of it quietly deducted before you even understand what happened. You're 17, accidentally doing international finance in a language you don't speak, and somehow every single misunderstanding ends with less money sitting in your pocket. The international nature of the work turned your finances into a genuinely bewildering tangle. You earned money in one country, but you might legally reside in another, working through an agency headquartered in a third, paid out in a currency that matched none of them. Each of these countries had its own tax code, its own paperwork, its own fee structure, and nobody involved was particularly interested in helping a teenager make sense of any of it. Picture the sheer complexity in practice. A job in Paris paid in one currency, a booking in Milan paid in another, work in New York a third again. Each payment had to be converted, and each conversion quietly took its own small bite out of the total. Money earned abroad might be taxed abroad, then potentially taxed again back home, tangled up in treaties and rules that even adults with professional accountants struggle to navigate cleanly. You had no accountant, no advisor, nobody explaining any of it to you in plain language. The money did eventually sort itself out, in a manner of speaking, always somehow, in the direction of you having less than you'd expected, and never quite understanding exactly why. The language barrier made everything harder still. Contracts, tax forms, financial documents arrived in languages you didn't read, full of terms you wouldn't have understood even in your own native tongue. You signed what you were told to sign, agreed to what you were told to agree to, trusting the people around you to guide you correctly, which is an enormous amount of trust to hand over inside a business already built on quiet deductions. Consider the vulnerability this created. Complexity is a wonderful hiding place for lost money. When the rules are impenetrable, when the paperwork is foreign, when nobody bothers explaining anything clearly, it becomes nearly impossible to notice if something has gone quietly missing. A charge here, a fee there, an exchange rate that seems a touch unfavorable. All of it simply disappears into the general fog of international confusion, unquestioned because it is, functionally, unquestionable. It's a bit like trying to play a genuinely complicated board game where the rules are printed in 4 different languages. The other players are keeping score, and you're told repeatedly not to worry about the details. You might well end up losing badly, and you would have absolutely no way of knowing whether you lost fairly, because you never understood the rules you were supposedly playing by in the first place. The taxes alone could be brutal. Earning across several countries could mean facing tax obligations in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, and without any expert guidance, a young model might end up paying far more than necessary, or find herself tangled in obligations she never even knew existed. Money that looked, on paper, like clean earnings turned out to be partly owed to a government she'd barely even visited. So your international career, so glamorous from the outside, was a genuine financial labyrinth from the inside. You crossed borders chasing work, earning in one place, taxed in another, converting in a third, losing a little at every single step. You were a teenager conducting accidental international finance in languages you didn't speak, and the house, as ever, seemed to win every single hand you didn't even realize you were playing. Let's discuss upkeep, because looking naturally flawless turns out to be astonishingly expensive. Your hair has to be maintained, your skin has to be tended, your body has to be exercised into whatever exact shape the industry currently demands this particular month. There are salons, treatments, gym memberships, the endless small costs of being a product that must always look freshly unwrapped. None of it is optional, and much of it, unsurprisingly, quietly finds its way onto your account. You are paying constantly just to remain employable, in a career that could drop you the moment you stop paying. The effortless beauty the world so admired was, in truth, the product of relentless and expensive maintenance. The natural glow, the flawless skin, the perfectly kept hair, none of it was actually natural, and none of it was free. It was manufactured and sustained through a constant stream of appointments, treatments, and routines, all of which cost real money, and all of which were simply expected of you as the basic price of doing the job at all. Picture the ongoing demands. Your hair had to stay in perfect condition, meaning salons, products, careful upkeep. Your skin had to remain clear and radiant, meaning treatments and daily regimens. Your body had to hold precisely the shape the industry currently favored, meaning trainers, gyms, constant physical maintenance. You were, in a real sense, a garden that had to be perpetually tended, and gardens are never cheap to keep in bloom. None of this was optional in any meaningful way. A model whose appearance slipped even slightly, whose hair grew dull or whose shape drifted, became less bookable, and less bookable meant less work, and less work meant disaster. So the upkeep wasn't a luxury or a personal indulgence. It was a professional requirement, an ongoing investment you had to keep making simply to stay in the game, whether or not you could comfortably afford it. And much of this cost, one way or another, found its way back onto your account, joining the flights and the rent and the comp cards in that ever-expanding ledger. Whether charged directly or simply subtracted from your already meager earnings, maintaining your own marketability was a steady, relentless drain, a river of small expenses that never quite dried up because your appearance always needed tending. Consider the cruel logic buried in all of it. You had to spend money to look employable, but looking employable was the only way you could actually earn money. So you were trapped in a loop where staying bookable required continuous spending, and the moment you stopped spending on your own upkeep, you risked becoming unbookable, which would end your ability to earn anything at all. You couldn't afford the upkeep, and you couldn't afford to skip it either. It's a bit like owning a race car that only wins while it's kept immaculately maintained, except the maintenance costs nearly as much as the winnings themselves. So you pour your prize money straight back into the machine just to keep it running well enough to win the next race. The car gleams. Your bank account does not. And the moment you stop polishing it, the car simply stops winning. There was something quietly dehumanizing in all of this, too. You were treated and gradually came to treat yourself as a product that had to be kept in pristine condition, always looking freshly unwrapped, never showing the smallest sign of wear. The natural processes of simply being a living human being, tiredness, change, the ordinary passage of time, all became threats to your own value, threats to be fought off with constant, costly effort. So you tended yourself endlessly, the salons and the treatments and the gym sessions, all in service of an effortlessness that was anything but effortless. The world saw a naturally flawless creature who seemed to simply exist in a permanent state of beauty. What the world never saw was the expensive, exhausting, never-ending labor of maintaining that particular illusion. Funded entirely out of a wallet, the illusion was itself supposed to be filling. Here is the emotional trick underneath all of the financial ones. Your agency calls itself your family. They tell you they believe in you. They remind you warmly again and again of everything they've done for you, all while the debt quietly keeps growing. This language is not an accident. It's designed, whether consciously or not, to make questioning the bill feel like a betrayal, to make asking about your own money feel ungrateful. So you stay quiet, you stay loyal, you keep working. Because how, exactly, could you possibly doubt the people who love you, even as they gently, relentlessly empty your pockets? Of all the mechanisms that kept you compliant throughout this entire arrangement, this one was the most powerful, because it worked not on your wallet but on your heart. The agency never presented itself as a business extracting value from you. It presented itself as family, the people who discovered you, believed in you, plucked you out of your small hometown, and delivered you into a world of glamour. And gratitude, once carefully planted, is a remarkably effective way to prevent someone from ever asking hard questions. Picture how the language actually worked in practice. Whenever you had doubts, they would warmly remind you of everything they'd already done. They took a chance on you back when you were nobody. They invested in your future. They gave you a home, found you work, made you into somebody. All of it framed as love, as generosity, as the actions of people who genuinely cared, rather than as a set of ordinary transactions with charges quietly attached to each one. And so questioning any of it felt almost monstrous. To ask about your own money, to scrutinize the ledger, to wonder aloud whether the charges were even fair, would be to spit on all that supposed kindness, to reveal yourself as ungrateful, suspicious, disloyal. Families, after all, don't audit each other. Families simply trust. So the family framing quietly turned ordinary financial vigilance into a kind of emotional betrayal. And very few teenagers have the steel required to betray people who claim to love them. Consider how thoroughly this silenced you. A grown professional working at a reasonable arm's length from a plain business arrangement might reasonably demand a clear accounting, challenge an unfair fee, refuse an unreasonable term. But you were not at arm's length. You'd been embraced, told you were cherished, made to feel the entire relationship was deeply personal and warm. And you simply cannot negotiate coldly with people you've been carefully taught to love, especially when you were young and thousands of miles from your actual family. The warmth wasn't necessarily fake either, which is exactly what made it so effective. Some of the people around you may have genuinely felt real affection for you, may have genuinely believed they were helping. Sincere warmth and quiet extraction can coexist perfectly comfortably. The kindness could be entirely real, and the charges could still be steadily draining you. The reality of the affection only made the arithmetic that much harder to question aloud. It's a bit like a relationship where someone constantly reminds you of everything they've sacrificed for your sake, so that whenever you raise even a small concern, you feel guilty for having mentioned it at all. The debt of gratitude keeps you from ever addressing the actual financial debt sitting underneath it. You stay, and you smile, and you tell yourself that people who care about you this much surely couldn't be taking advantage of you. This emotional bind was in many ways considerably stronger than any contract could ever be. A contract can be studied, disputed, eventually escaped. But the feeling that you owe your loyalty, your trust, your silence to people who love you, that's a chain forged somewhere in the heart, and it doesn't respond well to logic. You could see plainly that the numbers weren't adding up, and still feel entirely unable to say so, because saying so felt like inflicting a wound on your own family. So you stayed quiet and loyal and grateful, working faithfully for the people who called you family while the debt quietly kept growing underneath it all. The love, real or performed, kept you docile in a way no mere contract ever could. And the great trick of it was this: the more they reminded you of their generosity, the harder it became to notice that their generosity was, all along, the very thing steadily emptying your pockets. Let's talk about time now, because time is not remotely on your side. In most careers, 25 is barely even the beginning. In yours, it can be the end. The industry hungers constantly for younger faces, and your face, however lovely, has a shelf life measured in a small handful of years. You feel it first in the castings, in the pauses, in bookings that gradually slow to a trickle. And here lies the real cruelty. Just as your earning years run out, the debt you accumulated across them is still sitting there, patient and entirely unimpressed by your birthday. Time was the one enemy no model could ever defeat, and it moved with genuinely brutal speed in this particular world. In most careers, your 20s form the foundation, the early years of a long, gradual climb, and 25 is still very much the beginning of everything. In modeling, that calculus flipped entirely on its head. Youth itself was the product, and youth, by its very nature, does not last. Picture the industry's endless appetite for the new. Fresh faces arrived constantly, each new crop younger than the last, each one dazzling and hungry and cheap to hire. The scouts kept scouting. The agencies kept signing. The supply of beautiful teenagers never once ran dry. In this constant flood of youth, a model who'd been working even a few years began quietly aging out, not because she had actually grown old in any real sense, but simply because newer, younger options kept appearing right behind her. You felt it before anyone ever said it aloud. The castings that once welcomed you warmly grew a little cooler. The bookings slowed, then thinned, then trickled to almost nothing. The pauses between jobs stretched longer and longer. Nobody ever announced that you were finished because nobody had to. The work simply began drying up quietly, redirected toward newer faces, and you were left to read the meaning buried in the growing silence of your own phone. Consider the particular cruelty of the timing here. The debt you'd accumulated, all those advances, expenses, and small charges, had built up during your working years on the spoken or unspoken assumption that your earnings would eventually clear it. But your earning years were short, cut off right around the age many other careers are supposed to be flourishing. And when the work faded, the debt didn't fade along with it. It sat there, patient and entirely indifferent, waiting to be paid by someone whose income had just collapsed. This was, perhaps, the deepest trap of all. A normal debt might be manageable given decades of future earning ahead to repay it, but a modeling debt often had to be settled within a career measured in a small handful of years. And if it wasn't cleared by the time your bookings dried up, you were left owing money with no obvious way remaining to earn it. The clock ran out on your income, while the debt itself kept quietly ticking on. It's a bit like an athlete whose body gives out young, except the athlete has been running up costs the entire time on the promise of a long career, only for that career to end abruptly at an age when most people in other fields are just getting started. The cheering stops, the contracts vanish, and the bills remain, entirely unmoved by how briefly the glory actually lasted. The psychological weight of all this was heavy, too. To be treated as old at an age when your peers in every other field were still considered young, to feel yourself becoming obsolete before you'd even truly matured, it did strange and genuinely painful things to a person's sense of self. Your value, you'd been taught all along, lived entirely in your youth, and youth was leaving, apparently taking your worth right along with it. So time did its patient work. The bookings faded. The fresh new faces kept arriving. And one day you looked up to find yourself considered finished at an age most people would call the very beginning. The debt, meanwhile, waited exactly where you'd left it, unimpressed by your birthdays, indifferent to your fatting prospects, still expecting to be paid in full by a young woman the industry had already quietly decided was too old. Now comes the reckoning. After years of glamour, of magazine covers and runways and being told over and over that you were a star, you finally sit down and read the full accounting of your entire career. And there it sits in cold ink. The advances, the rent, the comp cards, the flights, the couriers, the commission taken twice on every job. You add it up, subtract it, hopping desperately for a mistake somewhere in the arithmetic. There is no mistake. Despite everything you earned, despite the fortune your face alone generated for other people, the bottom line says you owe them. Somehow, the star is sitting in the red. Sooner or later, the moment of reckoning arrives when you finally see the whole picture laid out plainly in front of you. Perhaps your bookings had started slowing, and you needed to understand exactly where you stood. Perhaps you'd simply grown suspicious enough to demand a full accounting at last. However it arrived, the day came when you sat down with the complete ledger of your entire working life. All of it, the earnings and the charges together, in one long, cold column of numbers. Picture the strange dread of that particular moment. You had been famous. Your face had appeared in celebrated magazines, on runways in every major fashion capital, in campaigns seen by millions of people. By every visible measure, you had succeeded, been a genuine part of a glamorous world, generated real value for absolutely everyone around you. Surely, you thought, all of that must have added up to something substantial that actually belonged to you. Then you started reading the charges, the advances taken again and again just to survive the gaps, the inflated rent deducted month after month after month, the comp cards and their endless reprints, the flights that had carried you glamorously around the world, the couriers, the phones, the taxis, the countless tiny deductions, and the commissions taken from your side and quietly from the client's side too on every single job you'd ever booked. You added it all up, subtracting the mountain of charges from everything you'd earned, hopping desperately that the numbers might resolve into something positive, some reward finally for all those years of work. But the numbers refused to cooperate. The charges had kept pace with your earnings the entire time, and sometimes had outrun them entirely, so that at the very end of it all, the bottom line wasn't a fortune waiting for you. It was a debt. Consider the sheer disorienting shock of it. You had been a star, or near enough to one, and yet the accounting said you owed money to the very people who'd presented themselves, for years, as your family and your champions. All that visible success, all that fame, all that value your own face had generated. And somehow, when the ledger was finally tallied, you ended up owing them money instead. This was the true face of the illusion that gave tonight's whole story its title. You had earned, in headline terms, a genuinely great deal. But the structure of the business, the double commissions, the inflated rent, the advances with their quiet interest, the endless small charges, had been steadily diverting that money the entire time, so that the impressive sums you generated never actually became yours. You were the source of a fortune that flowed everywhere except into your own two hands. It's a bit like running a hugely successful little shop, ringing up enormous sales day after day, only to discover at year's end that the rent, the suppliers, and the fees have consumed every penny and then some, leaving you not with profit but with debt. The till was full, the shop was busy, and somehow you owe money anyway. So you sat with the statement that quietly ended the dream, staring at a bottom line that made no emotional sense whatsoever, even as it made perfect financial sense. The glamour had been real, the fame had been real, the fortune your face had generated had been entirely real, and there, in cold ink at the bottom of the page, sat the debt, the final devastating punchline to a career that had looked, from the outside, like nothing but pure success. Let's twist the knife just a little further. Those advances they so generously handed you were never simply loans in the friendly sense. In many cases, they carried genuine interest, quietly compounding while you were far too busy working to notice. So the money you'd borrowed to survive those first broke years had been steadily inflating the entire time, feeding on itself, growing larger even during the months you barely worked at all. It is a debt that never sleeps, never rests, and never once flew coach across an ocean the way you did to earn the money meant to pay it off. The advances had always been loans, however warmly they were offered across that desk, and loans in the ordinary course of things frequently carry interest. This was the detail that gave the debt its most sinister quality, because it meant what you owed didn't simply sit still, patiently waiting to be repaid. It grew. It expanded quietly in the background, feeding on itself, becoming steadily larger the longer it went unpaid. Picture the actual mechanics of it. You borrowed a sum to cover your rent or your flights during a particularly lean stretch. That sum began, from the very moment you took it, to accrue interest, a little more added on top, and then interest on that new, larger amount, and so on. Compounding is a slow, quiet process, easy to overlook in any single moment, but utterly relentless over time, and it does its work whether you're paying attention to it or not. And you were not paying attention, because how could you possibly have been? You were 17, then 20, exhausted, jet-lagged, flying between continents, grinding through castings and shoots, far too consumed by the sheer effort of the work itself to sit down and calculate compounding interest on debts you barely even understood you'd taken on. Consider the especially bitter timing of the compounding. The debt grew fastest, in a real sense precisely when you could least afford it during the lean months, when work was scarce and income dried up. In those quiet stretches, you earned very little, but the interest kept accruing all the same, so the gap between what you owed and what you could actually pay widened even as you sat idle, waiting for the phone to ring. The debt worked hardest exactly when you were resting. This is the cruel arithmetic that traps so many borrowers throughout history, in every walk of life. A debt that compounds can outpace your ability to repay it, growing faster than you can chip away at it, so that you pour money into it and watch it barely shrink, or even continue to swell regardless. You run and run, and the finish line keeps quietly moving further away, powered by an interest rate that never once tires. It's a bit like trying to bail out a small boat with a bucket while water keeps seeping in through a leak you simply cannot reach. You bail and bail, working yourself ragged, and the water level barely drops, because the leak never actually stops, and the sea itself is endlessly patient. The interest was your leak, quietly undoing every effort you made to get ahead. There was a grim kind of poetry in the contrast. You had crossed oceans to earn the money meant to repay this debt, flying yourself ragged, working yourself hollow, physically hauling your exhausted body around the entire world in pursuit of the fees. And the debt, meanwhile, had done absolutely nothing at all except sit there and grow effortlessly, feeding on itself in the dark, expanding without lifting a single finger, while you spent your youth trying desperately to catch it. So the interest turned an already punishing debt into something close to inescapable, a figure that swelled quietly whether you worked or rested, whether you paid attention or not. The money you'd borrowed simply to survive your broke early years had become a living, growing thing, and no matter how many oceans you crossed to feed it, it always seemed to have grown a little larger by the time you looked again. Suppose you've finally had enough, and you want to switch agencies, or simply walk away entirely. Reasonable enough, except you owe them, and that debt turns out to be a chain. Leaving while still in the red is complicated, actively discouraged, and sometimes contractually forbidden outright until the balance finally clears. So the very system that put you in debt now uses that same debt to hold you exactly in place. You're free to go, in theory, the way a fish is technically free to leave a net, provided it can first convince the net to open, which it has absolutely no intention of doing. At some point, many models arrived at the entirely sensible conclusion that they wanted out, whether to join a different agency offering better terms, or simply to walk away from a situation that no longer served them at all. This was a perfectly reasonable desire, and it ran straight into the debt, which turned out to be not just a financial burden, but a genuine mechanism of control, a chain holding you precisely where you already were. Picture the bind clearly. You owed the agency money, sometimes a considerable amount, thanks to all those advances and charges accumulated over the years. That debt did not simply vanish because you wished to leave. In many cases, your contract tied your ability to depart directly to the settling of your balance, meaning you couldn't freely walk away until you'd paid what you owed, which, given your finances, you very often could not do. So the debt became a trap in the most literal possible sense. The very same system that had steadily put you in the red now used that redness to keep you exactly in place. To leave, you needed to clear your debt. To clear your debt, you needed to earn. To earn, you needed to keep working through the very agency you wished to leave. The exit door was locked, and the only key was money you simply did not have. Consider the elegant awfulness of the whole arrangement. Had the agency simply paid you well and let you keep your own earnings, you would have been free to leave whenever you liked. But because you owed them, you were bound. The debt did double duty, first draining your finances, and then, having drained them, serving as the very shackle that kept you from escaping to somewhere better. Your own poverty had become your prison. The discouragement wasn't always written into the contract either. Sometimes it was simply understood, communicated through gentle warnings and warmth and the ever-present language of family. Leaving was framed as betrayal, as folly, as a mistake you would surely come to regret. Between the contractual obstacles and the emotional pressure, the message stayed consistent throughout. You do not get to go. Not really. Not while you owe us. It's a bit like a fish caught in a net, technically still able to swim, still alive, still moving, but unable to actually leave because the net simply will not open for it. The freedom is theoretical. The net is entirely real, and no amount of swimming changes the fact that you're held gently but firmly in place until someone decides to let you out, which they have absolutely no reason to do while you remain both useful and indebted. This lack of any real exit is exactly what separated a fair business relationship from something considerably closer to entrapment. In a fair arrangement, both parties remain free to walk away at any time. Here, one party held all the money, all the records, and the debt that bound the other one firmly in place. You could disagree. You could be deeply unhappy. You could dream endlessly of leaving, and none of it changed anything, because the door only ever opened one way, and the key was held entirely by the very people you wished to leave behind. So you stayed, not because you wanted to, but because you genuinely couldn't afford to go. The debt that had quietly emptied your pockets now quietly guarded the exit too, ensuring that the person most eager to leave was precisely the person least able to. Now let's fast forward, because this particular story does eventually turn. In the years that followed the golden era, models began comparing notes with one another, and a troubling pattern slowly emerged. That double commission, that suspiciously uniform slice taken from absolutely everyone, began to look a lot less like coincidence and a lot more like a coordinated arrangement. Lawsuits followed, accusing the big agencies of quietly agreeing among themselves to keep their fees high at the model's collective expense. The very industry that had billed its brightest stars for messengers and moisturizer suddenly found itself the one being asked to explain its own math. For a long time, the arrangements described throughout tonight's journey simply went unquestioned, accepted as the ordinary, unremarkable way things had always been done. But nothing stays hidden forever, and eventually, the models comparing their experiences began noticing that something wasn't quite adding up. The story does turn in the end, though slowly, and the ones who'd been doing all the billing finally found themselves facing hard questions. Picture how the pattern actually emerged. Individually, each model had experienced her own version of the charges, her own commission, her own confusing statement, and assumed it was simply her particular situation, just the cost of doing business. But when models finally began comparing notes with each other, a striking consistency appeared. The same slice, the same additional fee charged not just to models, but to clients too, seemed suspiciously uniform across all the major agencies, as though everyone involved had quietly agreed on the number in advance. That uniformity was the crucial clue. In a genuinely competitive business, you'd expect agencies to compete on their fees, some charging more, some less, jostling for both models and clients. Instead, the big agencies all seemed to charge remarkably similar amounts, particularly on that additional commission taken from clients. And when competitors all charge the exact same suspiciously convenient figure, it starts to look a lot less like coincidence, and a lot more like an understanding reached quietly behind closed doors. So the lawsuits came. Models and their lawyers alleged that the major agencies hadn't actually been competing on these fees at all, but had quietly coordinated, effectively agreeing among themselves to keep that commission artificially high, all at the direct expense of the very models whose labor had generated the money in the first place. The accusation was, in essence, that the entire double commission structure had been propped up by an arrangement that should never have existed at all. Consider the reversal sitting at the heart of this. For years, the agencies had held all the power, kept all the records, and simply demanded that every model trust the arithmetic without question. Now, at long last, the tables turned, and it was the agencies who had to open their books, explain their fees, and justify the very charges they'd treated for so long as beyond any real question. The people who'd billed their own stars for couriers and face cream suddenly found themselves the ones being audited. It's a bit like a group of shopkeepers who all charge their suppliers the exact same unusually high handling fee, year after year, insisting it's simply the going rate, until someone finally asks why the rate happens to be identical everywhere, and whether they'd all quietly agreed on it in a back room somewhere. The uniformity that had once looked like the natural order of things suddenly looked like something requiring a real explanation. The reckoning didn't undo the years that had already passed, of course. It couldn't return the youth that had been spent, the debts that had piled up, the fortunes that had quietly flowed away. But it did, at last, drag the arrangements out into the light, force a public accounting, and challenge the long-standing assumption that the way things had always been done was simply the way things had to be done. The math, so long unquestioned, was finally, publicly questioned aloud. So the story turned slowly, belatedly, and the industry that had spent so long presenting its charges as simply how things were found itself on the other side of the ledger for once, asked to explain its own suspiciously tidy numbers. The reckoning came for the agencies at last, and the great uniform slice they'd all been quietly taking, so long accepted as ordinary, was finally hauled into the daylight and made to answer for itself. And so we arrive at the end of the runway. The 1990s supermodel was sold to the world, and to herself, as the ultimate winner, a person who turned simple beauty into unimaginable wealth. And for a rare few, that was entirely true. But for so many others, the glamour was a beautifully lit stage built directly over a trapdoor, where the money flowed in dazzling amounts and flowed right back out again through rent and advances and fees taken twice on the very same job. You could be famous on every cover in the world, and still, at the end of the month, owe your own agency for the bed you'd been too exhausted to properly sleep in. We arrive at last at the end of tonight's journey, where all the threads finally come together. The image of the era, the supermodel as the ultimate winner, the woman who transformed her own beauty into unimaginable riches, was one of the most dazzling illusions of the entire age. And like the best illusions, it contained just enough truth to be believed, because for a rare handful at the very top, the fortune truly was real. But for the vast majority standing beneath those few, the glamour concealed a very different reality altogether. Picture the whole thing as a beautifully lit stage, all warm glow and shimmering surfaces, built directly over a trapdoor. Above the boards, everything looked like triumph, fame, wealth, effortless success. Below them waited the debt, patient and dark, ready to swallow the money the moment it appeared anywhere on the stage above. And the money did appear in genuinely dazzling numbers, the headline fees, the impressive day rates. But it flowed in one side and straight out the other, drawn away by the inflated rent, the endless advances and their compounding interest, the fees taken twice, once from you, once from the client. The wealth passed through you like water through a sieve, impressive in its total volume, negligible in what it actually left behind. Consider the strange, cruel completeness of the illusion. You could achieve the very pinnacle of visible success, your face on every cover in the world, your name known across continents, and still find yourself, at the end of a hard month, owing money to your own agency for the overpriced bed you'd been too exhausted to properly sleep in. Fame and poverty, side by side, was not a contradiction in this particular world. For a great many people, it was simply how the story went. Throughout tonight's wander, we've traced how it all fit neatly together, the fairy tale of discovery, the contract you couldn't fully read, the apartment that charged a small fortune, the go-sees, the tests, the tape measure, the prestige that paid nothing at all, the advances that quietly cost everything, the double commission, the delayed checks, the compounding interest, the debt that held you firmly in place. Each piece on its own seemed almost reasonable. Together, they formed a machine expertly designed to turn dazzling earnings into quiet, patient debt. And yet we shouldn't let the arithmetic erase the humanity sitting underneath all of it. These were real young women, brave and hopeful, who left home as teenagers to chase an extraordinary dream, who endured the exhaustion and the hunger and the endless scrutiny with genuinely remarkable resilience. Many found real friendship in those crowded apartments, real artistry in the work itself, real moments of genuine wonder amid the grind. The illusion was cruel, but the people living inside it were entirely, admirably human. It's a bit like a magnificent stage magician's trick, where the audience gasps at the wealth conjured before their eyes, never seeing the hidden compartments through which it quietly disappears. The spectacle was genuine. The wonder was genuine. And the vanishing, too, was genuine, however invisible it remained to the watching world outside. So we reach the end of the runway, where the beautiful illusion finally stands fully revealed. The supermodel who seemed to have everything, and who often, at the end of the month, had less than nothing at all. The dazzling numbers that flowed in and flowed right back out. The fame that could coexist so easily with debt. It was a world of extraordinary glamour, built directly over a trapdoor. And tonight, at last, we've looked beneath the stage and seen exactly how the trick was done. So there you have it, a single, dazzling, exhausting, quietly bankrupting era in the life of the 1990s supermodel. You woke up with perfect cheekbones and an agency that already believed you owed it money. And you spent the years that followed discovering exactly how right they'd intended to be. You flew across oceans on borrowed cash. You slept in a bunk that cost a fortune. You walked runways that paid in jackets. You smiled through hunger and posed for covers the whole world admired, while your bank account quietly dissolved beneath you. And yet, think of what it actually took to live that life. The courage to leave home as a teenager and cross the entire world alone. The resilience to absorb 100 quiet rejections in a single day and still glow on command for the camera. The grit to keep walking, keep smiling, keep going on almost no sleep and even less food, in a business that measured your worth by the inch and discarded you by the year. Whatever the final ledger said, that endurance was completely real, and it belonged entirely and only to them. Because behind every famous face was a young person being remarkably brave in a world that was not always kind to her. And beneath all the glamour was a simple, human story of hope, ambition, and the stubborn refusal to give up on a dream, even when the arithmetic was quietly rigged against her from the very first signature. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, the one you actually own, in a home whose rent is honestly yours, maybe spare a gentle thought for those dazzling, exhausted young women who turned beauty into spectacle and asked for so little of the world in return. History is often stranger and sadder than it looks under the studio lights. But it is also proof, again and again, that people are hopeful, stubborn, and quietly, wonderfully resilient. Let's slow down for a moment and meet a few composite figures. Not any single real person, but the kind of girl who existed by the hundreds, stitched together here from patterns that repeated so often across the decade that they stopped being anecdote and became simply how things were. Call her the catalog girl. She never touched a runway in Paris, never landed a fragrance contract, never had her face plastered across a bus shelter. She worked steadily, though swimwear catalogs in the winter, department store flyers in the spring, the occasional regional print ad that paid modestly but reliably. On paper, she was a working professional in a glamorous industry. In practice, she spent 4 years in the crowded apartment, watched her rent quietly outpace her bookings more months than not, and eventually aged out somewhere around 23 without ever once appearing on a magazine cover anyone would recognize. She wasn't a failure. She was, statistically, the industry's actual median outcome, and nobody made a documentary about her, because nothing about her story photographed well. Call the second one the almost girl. She had the bone structure, the walk, the right agency backing her. For 18 months, she was genuinely close. A major designer used her twice in a single season. A scout from a beauty conglomerate flew in specifically to see her book. And then, for reasons nobody ever fully explained to her, the momentum simply stopped. The casting director who championed her moved to a different house. The look that had been fashionable that year quietly went out of fashion the next. She kept working, go-see after go-see, test shoot after test shoot, chasing a version of momentum that never quite returned, absorbing the accumulated debt of those 18 promising months long after the promise itself had evaporated. Call the third one the survivor. She was one of the rare ones who actually did land a beauty contract, whose face genuinely did end up on a perfume bottle sold in duty-free shops around the world. She is the reason the fairy tale kept circulating, the proof of concept the entire industry pointed to whenever a 17-year-old asked whether any of this was really worth it. And even she, by her own later account, spent her first 3 years in exactly the same debt as everyone else. The same overpriced apartment, the same comp card reprints, the same unpaid test shoots, before the beauty contract finally arrived and rewrote her balance sheet in a single stroke. Her story was real. It was also the exception the whole machine was built to advertise. These three composite figures matter because they map, roughly, onto the actual shape of the pyramid described earlier: the broad, invisible base, the thinning middle, and the vanishingly narrow peak. If you'd polled 100 girls signed by a major agency in any given year of the decade, something very close to this distribution is what you'd have found. Most catalog girls, a meaningful handful of almost girls. And if the agency was large and well-connected, perhaps one, maybe two, genuine survivors. Now let's talk about how the outside world came to know almost nothing about any of this. The magazines that built the industry's public image had, structurally, very little incentive to report on its financial machinery. A glossy profile of a rising star sold copies. An investigative piece on how that same star's agency had structured her debt did not, and worse, risked souring the working relationship between the magazine and the agencies it depended on for access to talent. So coverage of models, almost without exception, followed the fairy tale template laid out earlier in tonight's story: the discovery, the meteoric rise, the glamorous lifestyle, the private jets. The itemized statement never made it into the profile, because nobody with access to that statement had any reason to hand it to a journalist, and the model herself, bound by the same family language explored earlier, rarely felt she had standing to say anything at all. Television coverage followed a similar pattern, though with its own particular flourish. Documentary crews loved backstage footage of Fashion Week, the chaos, the changing, the practiced glamour of it all, because it was visually spectacular and required no explanation of contracts or commissions to be entertaining. A camera lingering on a runway walk told a complete story in 90 seconds. A camera lingering on a ledger told nothing at all unless someone stopped to explain what the numbers meant. And nobody making entertainment television in that era had much appetite for pausing the spectacle to do so. There was also a subtler mechanism at work, one that had less to do with deliberate concealment and more to do with genuine difficulty. The financial structure described throughout tonight's journey was, by design, diffuse: a little debt here, a little commission there, a fee taken quietly on both sides of a transaction, spread out across years and countries and currencies. It was not one dramatic villain doing one dramatic bad thing. It was 1,000 small, individually defensible charges, and a story built from 1,000 small charges is a genuinely difficult story to tell in a magazine spread or a television segment. Scandal needs a single clear culprit and a single clear victim. This system had neither, which is precisely why it survived as long as it did without serious public scrutiny. Even the models themselves, for years, largely lacked the vocabulary to describe what had happened to them. When your entire financial life has been managed by someone else, when you've never once seen a full accounting, it is genuinely difficult to articulate exactly what went wrong, even to yourself, let alone to a reporter. It took the passage of years, and the slow comparing of notes described earlier in tonight's story, before the pattern crystallized clearly enough for anyone to put a name to it. When the lawsuits finally did arrive, they arrived carrying real weight, precisely because they came with documents attached: actual contracts, actual statements, actual side-by-side comparisons showing the same suspicious commission structure, repeated across supposedly competing agencies. This was no longer one model's complaint about one bad experience. It was a paper trail, and paper trails are considerably harder for an industry to wave away than a single disgruntled voice. The legal proceedings that followed forced a kind of disclosure the industry had never previously had to provide. Agencies that had spent decades simply presenting their fee structures as an unquestionable fact of doing business now had to produce records, answer formal questions under oath, and explain in plain, unglamorous language exactly how a client fee and a model commission on the same booking had come to be calculated the way they had. The language of family, so effective at silencing a frightened 19-year-old across a desk, carried considerably less weight in a courtroom. None of this undid the actual decades that had already passed. The women who'd spent their working years in that overpriced bunk bed, absorbing compounding interest on advances they barely understood, did not get those years back. But something did shift permanently in how the business operated afterward: a greater expectation of transparency, a somewhat clearer accounting of charges, a public record establishing that the arithmetic really had been rigged in ways that went beyond simple bad luck or an individual model's poor negotiating position. The industry that had built its glamour on the backs of never having to explain itself was, for the first time, made to explain itself in detail. It's worth sitting with what that reckoning actually changed, and what it didn't. It changed the paperwork, the disclosures, the degree to which a young model today might reasonably expect to see a clear statement of her own earnings and deductions. It did not change the underlying economics of a business built on youth, scarcity, and the enormous gap between a handful of superstar names and the broad, invisible base beneath them. The pyramid, in its essential shape, survived the lawsuits. What survived alongside it, at least, was a paper trail, proof that the gap between the fairy tale and the ledger had never been an accident. And so the composite girls from earlier in this section, the catalog girl, the almost girl, the survivor, all eventually became, in their own ways, part of that paper trail. Their pooled experience, compared and cross-referenced years after the fact, is what finally turned 1,000 individually shrugged-off charges into a pattern nobody could keep waving away. It took the whole pyramid comparing notes to finally see the shape of the machine that had been built around each of them individually. No single girl on her own ever could have seen it. Together, belatedly, they did. That, in the end, is the quiet coda to tonight's story. Not a single villain unmasked, not one dramatic courtroom moment that fixed everything, but a slow, collective act of comparison, models talking to other models, years after the fact, piecing together a shared reality none of them had been able to see clearly while they were still living inside it. The glamour had been individual. The reckoning, when it finally came, was collective. And it is that collective act, ordinary young women quietly comparing notes, until an invisible structure became visible at last, that deserves to be remembered every bit as much as the covers, the contracts, and the runway lights. Let's step back from any single model's ledger for a moment and look at the wider economic machine she was standing inside, because none of what happened to her happened in a vacuum. It happened inside a business that was, at every level, built around the same essential trick: extracting maximum value from a resource that was, by design, temporary, replaceable, and largely unable to negotiate for itself. Consider the agencies themselves as businesses, stripped entirely of the family language for a moment. An agency's actual product was not glamour. Its actual product was access to bookable faces, delivered reliably to clients who needed them. And the raw material for that product was an endless, self-replenishing supply of teenagers, arriving from small towns and distant countries in numbers far exceeding the number of jobs actually available. This imbalance, more than any single clause buried in any single contract, was the true engine of everything described throughout tonight's story. When supply vastly outstrips demand, the party controlling access to the demand holds nearly all the leverage, and every single mechanism we've walked through tonight, the rent, the comp cards, the double commission, the debt, was simply leverage expressing itself through paperwork. Picture the agency's spreadsheet, if such a thing had existed in as clean a form as we're imagining it now. On one side, a roster of several hundred signed models. On the other, a finite number of paying bookings in any given month. The agency's job, financially, was never really to make each individual model rich. It was to keep the roster full, keep the churn manageable, and extract a reliable margin from the volume passing through the system. A margin built not primarily from any single spectacular booking, but from the accumulated weight of rent, fees, and commissions charged, quietly and repeatedly, across hundreds of ordinary working months for hundreds of ordinary working girls. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire story in a slightly different light. The agency didn't need any individual model to become the next great beauty contract name in order to profit handsomely from her. It profited from her the moment she signed, through the comp cards and the apartment and the advances, regardless of whether her career ever amounted to anything more than a handful of catalog bookings before she aged out at 23. In a strange way, the catalog girl described earlier, unglamorous, unremarkable, ultimately unsuccessful by the industry's own standard, was every bit as profitable to her agency as the rare survivor who eventually landed the fragrance contract. Possibly more so because her debts, unlike a beauty contract's windfall, never required the agency to actually pay out anything substantial in return. This is the part of the economics that the fairy tale most carefully obscures. The industry's public story was always about the rare spectacular success, because that story sold magazines, inspired new recruits, and justified the whole system to anyone who paused to question it. But the industry's actual balance sheet was built on volume, on the broad, unglamorous base of the pyramid, on thousands of catalog girls generating small, steady, reliable margins across years of ordinary bookings. The superstar names were the advertisement. The ordinary girls were the business. Consider, too, how this shaped incentives around who got signed in the first place. If an agency profited handsomely from a model regardless of whether she became famous, there was very little financial pressure to sign only the girls with genuine superstar potential. It made more sense, from a pure numbers standpoint, to sign as many plausible-looking teenagers as possible, extract the predictable revenue from rent and comp cards and advances across the whole group, and simply let the roster itself sort out, through the ordinary churn of bookings and rejections, which handful might eventually become the exceptions. Every signed model, successful or not, was a small guaranteed revenue stream the moment she stepped off the plane. The scouting process described at the very beginning of tonight's story wasn't really searching for stars. It was stocking inventory. This also explains something that puzzled outside observers for years: why an industry supposedly built around scarcity and exclusivity behaved, financially, more like a volume business quietly wearing an exclusive mask. The public-facing story was about rarity, about being chosen, about the one-in-a-million face. The private ledger was about scale, about signing enough girls that the group-level economics worked regardless of any individual's outcome. These two stories coexisted the entire time, one displayed prominently on the cover, the other filed quietly in the back office. None of this is to suggest that individual agents or bookers were uniquely villainous, sitting somewhere calculating this cynically in real time. Many of the people working inside these agencies genuinely did believe in the girls they signed, genuinely did want to see them succeed, genuinely did feel the affection the family language expressed. The system did not require malice to function. It only required a structural arrangement in which extracting steady value from an oversupplied, under-negotiated, largely powerless group of young workers was simply the ordinary, unremarkable way the business operated. The water everyone swam in, questioned by almost nobody, because questioning it would have meant questioning the entire foundation of an industry that, on its surface, looked like nothing but glamour. Which brings us finally to the question tonight's story keeps circling back around: where exactly did the money go? Not into any single villain's pocket in the end. It went, distributed and diffuse, into rent collected from apartments that housed 6 girls at a time, into comp cards reprinted by the hundred, into advances that quietly compounded, into commissions taken twice on the same booking. It went, in other words, into the ordinary operating machinery of a business that had figured out, structurally and almost accidentally, how to profit reliably from youth, hope, and an acute absence of bargaining power. regardless of whether any individual carrying that youth and hope ever became famous at all. And so we return, one final time, to the image we opened with, the teenager standing in a shopping mall food court, ketchup on her chin, being told she could be huge. She was never wrong to feel that lightning strike of possibility. Some girls really did go on to become huge, in every sense the word implies. But the business standing behind that lightning bolt had, quietly and structurally, arranged things so that it would profit handsomely from her either way. Whether she became a legend whose face sold perfume in airports around the world, or whether she simply worked steadily for 4 unglamorous years before going home, a little wiser, and considerably poorer than the fairy tale had ever promised her she'd be. That, in the end, is the fuller shape of the story tonight set out to tell. Not simply that a handful of individual young women were charged for messengers and moisturizer, though they certainly were, but that an entire, highly profitable industry had been quietly built on the gap between what fame promised and what the ledger actually delivered. A gap wide enough to swallow years of a young life whole, and clever enough that almost nobody standing inside it at the time could quite see the shape of the machine they were standing in. History, as we said earlier tonight, is often stranger and sadder than it looks under the lights. It is also, stubbornly, a record of ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances with a resilience that the ledger never quite manages to capture. Whatever the final balance said, the courage it took to leave home at 17, to keep walking after the 100th rejection of the day, to keep glowing for a camera on an empty stomach, none of that was ever in the end on the agency's side of the books. That part belonged entirely to them. Good night and sleep well, in a bed that this time is genuinely your own.